Hello, and welcome to the Educators and Immigration podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Gerardo Mancilla. I immigrated to the United States at a young age and am currently working as an assistant professor of education. In this podcast, we will explore the intersection between various immigration statuses and how that relates to our K-12 educational system. We will explore how educators can support immigrant families, undocumented youth, and students with DACA. Join us to learn more about these topics, listen to our guest stories, and explore resources to support students. This is the Educators and Immigration Podcast.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Educators and Immigration. I'm your host, Dr. Gerardo Mancilla. I'm really excited to be here with Dr. Phitsamay Uy today as we talk about immigration and education and all the different ways that we continue to learn about supporting different communities and different populations across the United States. Dr. Uy is an associate professor of the leadership and schooling and the graduate coordinator for the Ed.D Program. She's also the core director for the Center for Asian American Studies at UMass Lowell. She received her doctorate of education from Harvard University Graduate School of Education. Dr. Uy is a Lao American K-21 educator, a community advocate, and an equity trainer. Her research focuses on academic achievement of immigrant and refugee students, with particular interest in Southeast Asian American students. She is also interested in family and community engagement of immigrant and refugee populations. Dr. Uy, I'm very happy to have you here on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me. This is such a pleasure.
Thank you. Can we begin by just you sharing a little bit about your story, who you are, and kind of how you got to where you are today?
Oh, sure. So I call myself an accidental academic because I never knew that I was going to become a professor. I didn't actually know what a professor is, right? So I was born in Hoi Sai, Laos, which is in the northern section of a Southeast Asian country. People mainly know Thailand and Cambodia or Vietnam, so we're right in the middle. So Laos is a landlocked country, Thailand is to our left, Vietnam is to our right, Cambodia is by our feet, and then Burma and China are on top of us on the head. So it's a Lao sandwich. So I was born there, but during 1963 to 1974, the U.S. government had conducted a secret war on Laos. So basically 2 million tons of bombs were dropped, and that's an equivalent to every 8 minutes for 24 hours for 9 years, a bomb was dropped. And unfortunately, during that time, all the bombs didn't detonate, so the bombs are still there. And so my family was there during the bombing campaign, and so we left Laos, and we were in a refugee camp for 2 years to get papers, right, to get refugee status and to come here to the United States. And so I've been in the United States, and I have 6, and as a refugee. But growing up, I didn't know I was a refugee, so I just thought I was an all-American girl growing up in New England. First, we were in Connecticut and Vermont, and then my college years in Massachusetts. And it was in a South Ethnic Identity course that I've learned the term refugee, and they said, and learned about the secret war. So I went through the whole K-12 system not knowing refugee or war.
Wow.
I just thought we were poor, and I thought that we lived, in the urbanized areas and were on welfare. And so I just thought that we were just poor kids, not necessarily understanding the historical context of why we were poor or why we were here.
Well, and even you're talking about the textbooks, not having representation, not having acknowledgments, not having the history. You mentioned it was called the Secret War.
Yeah, it's secret for a reason. Shh, don't tell anybody.
But the fact that there's no acknowledgement of it, or that students are not able to learn about the history, that's part of it too. You mentioned that you were a refugee and then you were able to go through the process to get your residence card. Was most of those years were you living as a refugee through most of those years then?
Yeah, so once you get refugee status, then you have to wait to prove your worthiness, right? And then you get your alien card, and then what you do is then get your citizenship after you get an alien card. And so my parents had to apply, and you had to take classes to learn the history. And Madeline Kunin was the governor, and she's like, the only difference between you and other people who got their citizenship, and she's like, it's because you guys have your clothes on. Other people were born into citizenship, right? And so that was her running joke, that refugees actually have to earn the right to become U.S. citizens.
Well, and the years that you spent as a refugee as well, it was a long process. It's not like you were here for 2 years and then you switch over. but rather a long process of being with a refugee status before there's even a pathway for you to apply for the resident card as well.
Correct.
Well, thank you for sharing that part of your story. And you mentioned that President Obama was the first sitting president that had gone to Laos and actually see what bombs are still there today.
Yeah. So during the Secret War, keep in mind that what most people know about the Vietnam War was that was our fight to stop communism, right? But in Southeast Asia, we had our own civil wars. So North Vietnam versus South Vietnam, the communist of Cambodia, they call the killing field time, right, is the Khmer Rouge, which is the red Khmer, so the communist Khmer. And then in Laos, it was the Pathet Lao versus the communists, right? So pro-democratic forces in the Lao. But the U.S. only sanctioned the war in Vietnam. They were not supposed to be in Laos. There was a Geneva Accord that says Laos is a peaceful territory, and that's why it was a secret. So they told people, the military papers that we now have access to, is that they were doing reconnaissance. They were looking for aerial shots, and the secret bombs were the United States government trying to stop the military supplies from China coming down to Vietnam. But we don't know any of this stuff, right? You barely get a paragraph about the Vietnam War, let alone the other U.S. military actions in other countries.
And just thinking about how the U.S. has been involved in so many other countries, it's what you mentioned, the small paragraph that what we might know, and then how much more we don't know, or we don't get taught, or we don't get addressed.
That's why it was significant that Obama was the first president that acknowledged the U.S. engagement and the bombs in the country. So people were like, whoa, we didn't have anything to do with it. When the bomb shelters were like, property of the U.S. government, you can't deny your own patent, right? And so he went to Laos during the ASEAN conference with the other Southeast Asian countries, because Laos was hosting it, and acknowledged it and said that we need to do more. So part of the work I did as a community organizer was first introducing the Secret War into the curriculum. So I helped create curriculum for high school and middle school teachers to teach that in places and have them do sort of a cross-cultural comparison, have you experienced it. And so when we did it in Seattle, they'd be like, well, my grandfather was a pilot in the war.
Wow.
Or when we piloted it also in Boston, they're like, oh, we're from Puerto Rico. They have bombing campaigns down here. And so it's when you start talking about the shared experience of U.S. and other countries, because it's the only empire that has over like 140 military bases all across the globe, right? But no one talks about that.
Well, and the impact that has been all over the world, too. I'm thinking about Latin America, too,
Yes.
and how the U.S. has been involved with many other Latin American countries, too. But we don't actually learn about each of those operations or what was the U.S. role in going into any of those places either.
Right, the School of the Assassins, or that we trained Noriega. Like, I had a friend he's like, oh yeah, I was the captain who trained Noriega how to parachute out of a plane just in case.
Wow.
So when you come to access with real people who have these experiences, their stories aren't told about what they're doing.
And one of the things you also share right now was about your research and the way that you're working with the community, working with teachers and working with students. So in your bio, it talks a lot about that you're focusing on the achievement of immigrant and refugee students. Can you talk to us a little bit more about some of those projects that you've been working on? And you mentioned the curriculum development. What are other projects that you are also working on?
Yeah, so when I was a K-12 teacher, I was an elementary teacher in Long Beach, California. And so there's a large Khmer population, right? Those are Cambodians. And then I went to Minnesota, and there was a large Lao population. And then I'm starting to hear stories from the community saying there's a 60 to 70% dropout rate, right? But the controlling image or the stereotype is like, Asians are the model minority. They don't drop out. It's the black and brown kids who drop out. And I'm like, have you been in my neighborhoods? Have you been in Long Beach? Have you been in the Twin Cities or even in Boston? And in certain places, there are smaller populations, but in large, like ethnoburbs, I think, there are large populations where kids are not doing well. And those are the kids who are coming from refugee places. And so in Cambodia, because the killing fields and the Khmer Rouge killed a quarter of their population, there's a large PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. So if you want to engage in these immigrant refugee communities that have had war, there was going to be some trauma, right? And so that's when I was noticing, talking to the families, that they don't want to talk about their trauma. So there's a culture of silence, like, why should we talk about that? We came here to get away from that. But the young kids are like, I don't know anything about my history. Why won't my parents tell me anything? And so they don't understand that they have this lack of a connection to their ethnic heritage or their ethnic community because the teachers don't tell them, the parents don't tell them. And here there's this young, Lao teacher's like, let's collect stories let's talk story. And they're like, no, you're not going to talk story with you because it's too painful.
Well, and you brought up really important points. The first one was the importance of desegregating the data to make sure that when you talk about Asian communities, that there's many different Asian communities, but specifically to desegregate the data that talks about Southeast Asian communities and how the population, how to analyze it to kind of understand how are they doing in school, what is the graduation rate, and trying to understand what are the different needs for the Southeast population community that might not be representative of the entire Asian community as well. Yeah. So that was an important point. The second thing that you talked about was also this idea about, as we think about teaching and telling your stories, parents' lived experiences that carry the pain, that carry the trauma, that carry the wanting to forget and put it in the past. How do we acknowledge and create a healing process for that population while simultaneously work with the younger population in understanding culture, identity, heritage, and also that pain that the parents also have with them. Yeah. So have you done any work in terms of like understanding maybe the different needs from the parents in terms of validating and acknowledging that pain and the PTSD and the lived experiences as opposed to the work that you might do with students?
Yeah, so there's a generational divide, right? And so when we talk about the parents' PTSD, there's also what is called second generational trauma, right? So when your parents flinches at like sharp noises, right, or they turn down the blinds, then you learn to live in the dark, right? You learn to also flinch, right? And so those are the things that you don't necessarily talk about, but that gets translated. With the parents, I use a lot of the culturally responsive, where I will go to the places where they do talk story naturally, right? And so in our Lao community, that's where they go to the temples, to the markets, to friends' places, right? So a lot of time as researchers, we're like, go in as a researcher and with your microphone and and so they're wary of people like, why are you coming to collect our stories? Because the last time the Southeast Asian governments came to collect stories, they used it and put them in concentration camps or so-called re-education camps, and then they were killed and never seen again. So there's a distrust of data collection because they don't know who you are and why you're taking the information. So you have to demystify that. So you have to work within community agencies that they trust and say, she's here to talk story because the students don't know any stories. One project was around collecting folk tales because there was no books that represented them. And I said, Auntie, so we would come together at the temple, eat food, and say, tell me about what your childhood was like. And always say before the war, right? Because sometimes the one single narrative is these are refugees, the wartime, but they lived rich lives full of culture and arts before the war. And I say, tell me about that. And if I could write a story to share with the local elementary kids so that they can learn about their heritage, because they too are concerned about the loss of culture over the generations, what would it be? So we collected the stories and we wrote it up and we made it bilingual, like Lao and Khmer, and English and Vietnamese and Korean, which is the Burmese one. And so one side would be the ethnic language, the other side would be the English for the younger generation to read, and then for the older generation. But in doing so, then we would hire the students to draw the pictures, so they would also be involved. So this one story about collecting stories, that's how I engaged the multiple generations. And then we had like a community reading about it. And so then we brought in all of the community members to read it. So for the Lao story, I had my mom and my son read it. So it was a beautiful time where they were both reading the same story. But my son read it in English and my mom read it in Lao to the audience.
Wow.
Right? And so that's how we do one type of story. And then the other one is around food. Food is where we tell stories around, right? So in Laos, it's Sabai Di, Jing Khao Ba, which is how are you? Have you eaten? Right? Even in our greeting, we ask have you eaten? And then your response, if you say, oh no, I didn't have time to eat, or I don't have, and so they're going to stop everything and feed you, right? Because at this level, it's still at the basic level that we need to nourish your body and give you food in order for you to sustain the work that you do, right? And for them, it's food is a communication style, but it's also the language of love. Because if you can't communicate with your younger grandchildren because they now speak English and not Lao, they can say, well, I made this for you. So I don't know how to help you with homework, but I can make sure you're fed so you're not hungry when you're doing homework. And so those are the type of things where now I'm working on the Lao Food Project, where talking about, because if you ask the kids, like, oh, what does it mean to be Lao? They're like, I don't know, because nobody told me anything. But then they'll be like, well, I eat sticky rice, and I eat mango salad, or a papaya salad, or chicken wings. And so for them, food is an identity piece. And so I have a research project that is talking about what is the role of food in the identity development of our Lao diaspora. And I think it's similar in other countries, Latinx countries, Persian countries, where food brings people together. And that's where you can collect stories and talk story, because that's the research methodology that is easier for our community to engage with.
And then that would also add the community building that goes around food, and how it becomes a natural place to share stories. And in Spanish, we say convivio, like co-live. And usually you have food when you have a convivio, because that's people bringing in their own food. So we could all share the food as well and be able to share the knowledge, the stories, whatever is going to be happening for that day.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I wanted to highlight, though, is you mentioned in order to get the stories, the culturally relevant or the culturally responsive thing to do was also acknowledge that it was before the war, that seemed to be like a very important topic to think about, like, how do we understand the lived experience or our lives prior to the war, to then be able to have the families and the students focus on that. What was the daily life like? What was the important food, traditions, customs, heritage, celebrations?
Music, right?
Music, yeah. So that's a really powerful way of thinking about it. And also, you're also doing this great, amazing thing of being a researcher and academic, but also being there with the community and providing support for the community as well. So you're not only just coming in to collect these stories, but rather you're making them as a way to work with the community to give them the stories back to them and having them read them as well. So there's important things of, as we think about academic, how we go and study with a specific population, but then also be able to contribute something to the population that I think is very powerful.
Yeah, we actually worked with nonprofit organizations. So the Cambodian Future Assistance, the after-school program called Sadinar, there's a Vietnamese language program, and then for the Lao community that does not have an organization, we work with the temple. So the proceeds of the books go back equally to all of those organizations that serve the community. So that's where it's a creative economy type of grant that we got to say, this is the way you can engage communities in at the place where it's relevant to them and it meets their needs. Instead of coming in with your research idea, you ask them first, like, what is it that you need? Like, what would you like? And like, ask to co-construct the research. And so it's much more participatory.
That sounds amazing. And the fact that you also, as you were telling your story, you were talking about different places around the United States where there are Southeast Asian communities that have been established as well. And so also for me, that comes to thinking about what is your context, what are the resources, what are maybe the religious associations, or what are the organizations that are already supporting the communities, and how do we work with them rather than trying to recreate something completely new for that aspect. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
One of the other things that you mentioned in your research is something called ritual of healing. Can you tell us a little bit more about the ritual of healing?
Yeah, because when you talk stories as an adult with PTSD, right? So I got diagnosed late. It was actually 2016 during the Trump administration. He was such a triggering figure that what I ended up learning more about is when you ask questions to your participants, sometimes it brings back memories of your own childhood, right? And I'm an empath, so I'm trying to relate and I'm trying to share and connect that. Sometimes that triggers my memory, and then I have an emotional reaction where I would cry with them. And so researchers are not taught to deal with the affective effect, right? Like the emotional part of our labor and the work. And so part of the ritual of healing is sharing the story. I experience it as the 4-year-old child who was experiencing the trauma during the refugee time. But as an adult, I can tell myself and that 4-year-old child that it's okay, right? And then I can move on. And that's part of that telling and retelling, because it's the stories that you get stuck in. But what the healing part is now that as an adult, I can acknowledge that was the younger Phitsamay, right? But now there is an adult Phitsamay says, it's going to be okay because I'm right here. You've survived it, right? And so right now, my eyes are kind of glazing over, so I'm semi-triggering myself. So sometimes it surfaces up and other times it doesn't. And for people with PTSD, we can't control that. And so when you work with the community, I ask the young researchers, don't plow through and make sure you get all your research questions, but actually look them in the eyes, think about how they are experiencing it, but also do research ahead of time, like what are the services available. And so for our Lao community, it's the Buddhist monks, right? They go to the temple for their healing. Other communities who believe in therapy, like I have a great therapist that I meet on a regular basis to help me with my trauma. It's understanding what the trigger points are, what the resources are, and making that information available to the participant as you're engaging them. And then using time, pausing, letting them use their own language, using their own words, because there's sometimes stories that we want to hear, but there's also stories they want to tell. So be open to the conversation and to the process, and know that it's not linear for all of your participants because they might have different triggers.
Well, and as you're saying that, the word self-care comes to mind, but it's also how do we talk about that self-care? How do we talk about that healing, not only for ourselves, and you mentioned the transfer of it, but also like the reliving of and the things that come back up for us. How do we have that conversation about what does it look like to take care of yourself, both your current self as well as your younger self, and being able to have that metacognitive conversation with yourself about here's where I am today, here's where I've gone through, and how do I make sense of both and be able to hold both of them simultaneously. But also this idea of having that conversation with your colleagues to say, what does it mean for us to go and support our community? And I really appreciated how you mentioned how do you create space for them to tell you what they want as well, and their stories and what they want to share, rather than what you think you want to go and support them with, and how you want to go and support them in that process. So thank you so much for sharing that aspect of it.
I think also doing that member check, right? Because we are so trained in our discipline to get the right answers, and so it's sitting in these dilemmas too, where we might get it wrong. Like our analysis of what it is, like be open to like the dissonance too, like the discrepant data. What aren't they saying? Because they're afraid, or they haven't processed, or they haven't gone to that. And so the starts and stops and the pauses too, like how long is the pause? What is the reaction? So sometimes the analysis doesn't actually have to just be discourse analysis and the words coming out of them, but also their emotional reaction, their physical reaction. And I always encourage people to do member check-in. This is what I heard you saying, and this is what I'm thinking. What do you think? And asking for that, as opposed to, did I get it right? And because that's what our goal is, perfection and getting the analysis right.
So I would like to kind of move a little bit to think about like what does this mean for students in schools? Mm-hmm. As you mentioned, one of the big issues that we're dealing with is anti-Asian hatred. Mm-hmm. A lot of hatreds, but one of the ones that it's been around for a while right now has been anti-Asian hatred, and it's not new. There's a history of other anti-Asian policies and practices too, so I want to acknowledge that that's been part of the U.S. history as well. Mm-hmm. But as you think about supporting students in schools right now and thinking about this climate with anti-Asian climate, mm-hmm. like what do you think would be helpful for like students to kind of, or for teachers to know to how to support students?
Yeah, I think it's really important to center the students and how they're feeling, right? It's the social emotional learning. And so while we have our curriculum, we have our standardized tests that we have to teach for, that if the student is not in an emotional and psychological safety space, they won't be able to learn. And so being able to observe the students, being able to develop a routine where you do check-ins to say, how are you all doing? How are you making sense of this anti-Asian hate? And I wouldn't have that open up in the beginning. It's like, Phitsamay, you're the only Asian kid. How do you feel about these people stabbing, Asian women 45 times or shoving that Asian grandmother into the subway system, right? So these are acts of violence. And so how do we deal with violence? Because it's so normalized in our media and everyday news that it's checking in with the students' emotional health to say, how are you doing? First and foremost, developing that relationship with them, and then being able to open it up where every day it's like, how are you doing? How are you making sense? How are you caring for yourself? And then how are we caring for each other? I think that's part of that, being centered and being available, because people who care about the Asian community will also be triggered in trauma. Like, that's my friend, or that's my neighbor. And so they need as much care too. And so sometimes we're like, oh, we're just going to target this one group that has been marginalized, when it's the community that is really collectively suffering. And I think that's how we can make that transition. But making the initiative to check in with people. And so I've had colleagues say, you know what, they don't talk to me the whole entire year. And then also with the anti-Asian hate, they're like, how are you doing? So it seems weird, out of the blue, out of context. You didn't care about me before, but now that we're on the news, you suddenly care, right? And so there's just like, it's trauma porn, right? It's like, it's the thing to do. And so people are going to question, why didn't you care before? And so that's why, like, just develop that relationship, because you never know when trauma is going to happen. But especially with students, develop the relationship, get to know that things might be changing for them and they might not understand. And you don't have to know the answer. It's just affirming for them to know that you're there and you care for them, and that if they want to talk, you'll be there to listen.
And you're talking about the importance of building that rapport with the students, the relationship with the students, and also letting them know that you see them as well. And not to have them feel like they're ignored, that they're invisible, that they're not seen or they're not welcomed in the space. But by building that relationship ahead of time with any student, then when the other situations happen, then that care seems more authentic than at that point, than just arbitrary, like, oh, this incident happens, let me check on this one student or that other student. But this idea of how do we consistently support our students to make sure that they know that they're cared for, that they're welcomed in our schools and they're seen in our schools, and that we care about them as well.
Yeah, because Angela Valenzuela does a nice piece about the culture of care. The students know which teachers care. The fake care versus the real care, the authentic caring.
Yeah. And the other population that you work with is Asian American teachers too. And so as you think about Asian American teachers, like, what are some other things that are important for people to know in terms of both the representation of teachers as well as how do we support teachers?
Yeah, it's the same thing, because they have to do this dual role where they're responsible for teaching, but they also might be hurting themselves and worried about their health and worried about their families. Because during COVID, if you're a Filipino, the majority of the nurses' populations are Filipinos. There's a staggering amount of Filipino nurses who died during COVID, but nobody talks about it. So there are families who are suffering during COVID and families who are suffering during the attacks. And so it's almost like a dual attack. And then they are the teachers who are responsible for students' care, and so no one's caring for them. And so, like you say, seeing them, being there for them, checking in on them, and knowing that they might have multiple balls that they're juggling and multiple people that they're taking care of. Because I take care of my mom takes care of my son, so there's multi-generational caring going on too. They need to be seen, they need to be validated, they need to be supported, just as students are as well.
Well, and as you mentioned, like the multiple ways of acknowledging the multiple roles, the multiple caring that they're doing, part of me is wondering, how do we demonstrate that? Or for the students, I feel like it seems a little bit, quote unquote, easier because it's a teacher doing it with each of her students. With the teachers, I feel like the care should also be coming from everywhere too. The students will show their care for the teachers simultaneously, but then it should be colleagues, it should be the principals, it should be the community members. And that's kind of one of the things I was thinking about, like that care should be coming from everywhere because of all the different caring roles that they have.
Yeah, they're caretakers. And that's where you ask, like, what do they need? So you ask them, how can I help support you? Can I cover resource for you? Are there, families that you want me to connect with? And so those are the acts of care, the way that, like, we have love languages, you can have caring languages. And for some people, it's time. Other people, it's for food. Other people, it's, physical affection or service. So, like, how do you show your care? Because sometimes it just might be nice to have a cookie or a brownie show up at your desk. I'm like, yes, chocolate, I need it, right? Yes. Versus I'm going to cover for you, to, if they hear a microaggression or a micro insult, becoming an ally and standing up for them. Like, anytime that you can show that care, because sometimes people don't know how to do that. So I say, ask. Like, you could say, I would love to give you a hug. Could you use a hug right now? That's a simple act of caring versus actually seeing them and acknowledging them and seeing how they're doing too.
Well, and even the examples that you provided gives us a wide variety of different ways of caring for somebody. The one that you didn't mention that it's in my mind is financial resources too. Yeah. Not necessarily for the teachers themselves, but oftentimes those caregivers are supporting everybody else. So thinking about what their students need, what do their community members need, what do their resources for the classroom or things like that that might be also important, that it might not be something financially beneficial for that person, but it's financially beneficial for the work that they're doing in terms of supporting others.
Yeah.
You mentioned that there's some books that have come out of your research as well. Are these books that are available for anybody to purchase?
Well, I haven't done any book project or in that proposal stage, but some of my articles about how American parents and how they navigate like working with families, that's in the Asian article. And then for the students centering themselves, that's the race, ethnicity, and education article called The Salience of Ethnicity, where teachers are at this racial level, like, oh, you're all Asians, whereas the Southeast Asians like, no, I'm Khmer, no, he's Lao, or he's like, they know their own ethnicity. Like that one is the centering of the ethnicity. So there are more journal articles and book chapters.
But the projects you did with the families, are those available for purchase, or are those were just more for that community?
Oh, that book is actually on the Southeast Asian Digital Archive. And so we digitize it because we know some families can't afford it. So we uploaded it on our website. So SEADA, SEADA. It's called Once Upon a Time. Here in the Western world, they say once upon a time, but we don't call that. We say a long, long time ago. That's how we start our stories. And so a long, long time ago is the book that you can download as a digital form, or if you want to purchase to give back to the community, that's also available on our Center for Southeast Asian American Studies at UMass Lowell.
Thank you. And if people are hearing the podcast and are listening and want to get more involved, as you mentioned, the community across the United States may look different. I'm based in Wisconsin, so the population might look different than Massachusetts versus California. What would be the best advice that you have for other educators, other community members, other people in the communities that want to know more about how to help different communities, and or more specifically Southeast Asian communities?
Yeah.
What would be some words of advice that you would give them?
Google's wonderful, right? So if you put in Southeast Asians, right, in Wisconsin, they might have some community. So there are Southeast Asians in all 50 states. So wherever you are, there will be a Southeast Asian, right? And so the resources differ. And so Googling and you can just say like community organizations or nonprofits that serve Southeast Asian, and they should populate. SEARAC is SEARAC, the Southeast Asian Action Resource Center, actually is a nonprofit group out of DC that actually tries to pull all that information together. There's a national LANA, Laotian American National Alliance, that has resources that are online too, right? So if you just Google certain Southeast Asians, then it's going to pop up like Boat People SOS or Viet Aid in Dorchester. Those are the type of organizations that you can connect with that have after-school programs, senior citizen, and then like in the California area, there's Stockton and temples and religious. So I would encourage you to visit any of the organizations, and they would be happy to connect with you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for that resource, because I feel like as we might have listeners all over the United States, something like that would be important to know. Or I'm also thinking about the teachers who have students in their classrooms and thinking about how can teachers continue educating themselves more about the different populations that we have in the United States.
Yeah, there's a great resource, the Smithsonian Learning Labs. We started writing lesson plans for teachers. We have a digital archive that is collecting primary documents and then showing teachers how to use the primary documents into the classrooms. And then for any teachers who want to teach about the legacies of war, which is the secret war and the bombing on Laos, we have also a curriculum that is on www.legacesofwar.org that they could use in either the high school or the middle school.
Thank you so much for those resources. I feel like those are very helpful. As we think about other topics or other themes, other conversations that we haven't covered yet, as we think about immigrants, refugee, Asian Americans, are there things that we haven't covered that you think would be important to share?
I think that there's the power of sharing stories across cultures, right? And then bridging, because the themes that we have happening and the issues and the dilemmas that we're facing, other marginalized communities are facing, Latinx, Native and tribal, indigenous communities, the African American and Black community. And so for like projects, I would love to see more connections across our communities. And wouldn't it be great if we could talk story with the Latinx families, with our Lao families, right? Or with our indigenous or Native Hawaiian families, because there are stories of love and loss and just being human and community that I think would resonate together.
Well, and even as you were explaining like some of the challenges, some of the opportunities as well, how much of the similarities might come across, and something like thinking about what are best practices,
Yes.
what are ways of supporting, what is like that you mentioned the trauma and re-traumatizing of telling the stories, the different generational experiences for the different communities that I feel like it's really powerful to kind of think about and think about that across different cultures too.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to say thank you again so much for being on the podcast.
You're
I'm
very
really excited
welcome.
about it. Thank you so much for sharing all the resources that you have, your commitment to the community, to the academia as well. And it's just inspiring to have you on the podcast.
Yeah.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Mahalo. In Laos, it's Khop Chai Lai Lai.
Mahalo.
Thank you.